I'm Elena Rodriguez, 42, and for 20 years, I've been the family's quiet backbone, while my husband Michael and teenage son Jake dismissed my broken English. Last Tuesday at Jake's school conference, everything changed when his teacher praised his multilingual abilities. Jake laughed and said, "Yeah, but my mom barely speaks English properly. It's embarrassing." The teacher looked confused. "But Mrs. Rodriguez, didn't you graduate summa cum laude in linguistics from Columbia? Your thesis on Romance language evolution was groundbreaking." The silence was deafening. 20 years of hiding my PhD, my fluency in 8 languages, my abandoned career as a UN translator, all to make my American husband feel superior. I'd dumbed myself down, spoke broken English at home, pretended I didn't understand complex conversations. But that day, something snapped. I looked at my son and husband, then spoke in perfect, articulate English. Perhaps it's time you learned who you've been living with. Like and subscribe if you've ever hidden your true self for family peace. The drive home from Jake's school was the longest 15 minutes of my life. Michael gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, while Jake stared out the passenger window in stunned silence. I sat in the back seat where I'd voluntarily placed myself for 2 decades, watching my family process the bomb I'd just detonated. "So," Michael finally spoke, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "You've been lying to us for 20 years. "I never lied," I replied in the crisp, articulate English that had once earned me academic accolades. "I simply adapted." Jake whipped around to stare at me. "Mom, you sound completely different." Like, completely different. The irony wasn't lost on me. My own son was shocked to hear his mother speak properly in what was supposedly her second language. I'd been so convincing in my act that even Jake, who'd lived with me his entire life, had never suspected the truth. When we arrived home, I walked straight to our bedroom closet and pulled out a box I'd hidden behind winter coats for 2 decades. Inside lay my Columbia University diploma, still in its original frame. The gold lettering seemed to shimmer as I carried it downstairs and placed it on the kitchen counter. Elena Rodriguez, Doctor of Philosophy in Linguistics, summa cum laude. I read aloud. Awarded June 15, 2003. Michael stared at the diploma as if it were written in a foreign language which, given his monolingual limitations, it might as well have been. The Latin phrases, the academic seals, the recognition of achievement that I'd buried to make him comfortable. But you always said you dropped out of college to work," Jake stammered. "I said I stopped going to school to work. I never said I dropped out." The precision of my words felt foreign on my tongue after years of deliberate grammatical errors and simplified vocabulary. I earned my doctorate at 25. I was the youngest person in my program. I remembered that day so clearly, walking across the stage at Columbia, my parents crying in the audience, my future stretching before me like an endless horizon of possibilities. I'd been offered a position with the United Nations as a translator, a dream job that would have taken me around the world, working with diplomats and world leaders. Instead, I met Michael 3 months later at a linguistics conference in Chicago. He was there representing his small marketing firm, trying to land international clients. I was presenting my research on how immigrant communities preserve their native languages while adapting to new ones. He approached me after my presentation, charming and confident, telling me how impressed he was with my work. "You're brilliant," he'd said over coffee that evening. "But you know, academia can be so limiting. Have you ever considered applying your skills in the real world?" At the time, I thought he was encouraging me to think beyond traditional career paths. I didn't realize he was already planning to clip my wings. Our courtship was whirlwind romance. He pursued me relentlessly, showering me with attention and praise. But I began to notice subtle shifts in his behavior whenever my education or abilities came up in conversation. He'd change the subject, make jokes about stuffy academics, or find ways to diminish my achievements. "You're too smart for your own good," he'd say with a laugh that never quite reached his eyes. "No wonder you're still single at 25. The comment stung because it played on my deepest insecurity. My academic success had often intimidated men, leaving me feeling like I had to choose between intellectual fulfillment and romantic love. Michael seemed different. He claimed to love my mind, but slowly, insidiously, he began to make me feel like my intelligence was a burden rather than a gift. After we married, the changes became more pronounced. He'd interrupt me when I spoke to his friends, explaining concepts I just articulated as if I couldn't speak for myself. He'd correct my pronunciation of English words, even when I was right. He'd make jokes about my accent, my syntax, my foreign way of thinking. "It's cute how you try so hard," he'd say when I'd express complex ideas, "but maybe try explaining it more simply. Not everyone went to fancy schools." Gradually, I learned that the easiest way to keep peace was to let him be the smart one. I started speaking more simply, making deliberate mistakes, asking him to explain things I understood better than he did. I watched my vocabulary shrink, my confidence erode, my voice grow smaller and smaller until it nearly disappeared altogether. Now, standing in my kitchen with my diploma between us, like evidence in a trial, I saw the full scope of what I'd sacrificed. Not just my career or my education, but my very self. 20 years, 7,300 days of pretending to be someone I wasn't. As I stood there holding my UN translator badge, the job I'd turned down to be Michael's wife, the weight of those years pressed down on me like a physical force. The badge was pristine, never used, still in its original case. I'd kept it all these years as a reminder of the path not taken, hidden away like everything else that represented my true capabilities. United Nations Conference Services, it read. Senior Translator, Romance Languages Division. The position had been mine, pending final paperwork, when I chose love over career. How naive I'd been. The deception hadn't started immediately. In our first year of marriage, I still spoke naturally, still referenced my education, still used my full vocabulary. But Michael's reactions were consistent to slight frown when I used a word he didn't know, a change of subject when I mentioned my research, a joke about professor wife that stung more each time he said it. I began to notice how he lit up when I asked him to explain things, how his chest puffed with pride when he could be the expert. So I started asking more questions, feigning confusion about concepts I understood perfectly. The first time I pretended not to know the difference between effect and effect. Watching him explain it with such satisfaction, I felt a piece of my soul wither. But it worked. He was happier, more affectionate, more present, and I told myself that was worth it. The linguistic sacrifices came next. I stopped correcting his grammar, even when he made glaring errors in front of colleagues. I started using me and him instead of he and I mispronounced words I knew perfectly well. I adopted the stilted syntax of a non-native speaker, dropping articles and using incorrect verb tenses. English is hard language for me, I'd say, watching him nod sympathetically, while inside I screamed. When Jake was born, I faced the hardest choice of all. Michael insisted we raise him American, which meant no Spanish at home. I thought this initially bilingual children have cognitive advantages, better problem-solving skills, enhanced creativity. But Michael was adamant. We're in America now, Elena. He needs to fit in, not be confused by foreign languages. Foreign. My native tongue, which I spoke with my parents and grandparents, which carried the poetry of my ancestors, was foreign, something to be hidden, ashamed of, eliminated. So I spoke to Jake only in my broken English, watching him absorb the message that his mother was somehow less than, somehow limited. I bit my tongue when he struggled with Spanish assignments in school, knowing I could help him master the language in weeks. Instead, I let Michael hire expensive tutors while I pretended ignorance. The intellectual isolation was crushing. I'd read academic journals in secret. Late at night when Michael was asleep, I'd write responses to articles in my head, formulate theories, imagine conversations with colleagues I'd lost touch with. But during the day, I'd discuss nothing more complex than grocery lists and weather. I took freelance translation jobs online, working under a pseudonym, telling Michael the small amounts of money came from cleaning houses. The work kept my skills sharp and gave me a secret source of income, but it also reminded me daily of what I'd lost. I'd translate complex legal documents, technical manuals, literary works using my doctorate-level expertise while pretending to be barely educated. The hardest moments came when Jake would bring friends over, and I'd hear him apologize for my English. "Sorry, my mom's English isn't great," he'd say, and I'd smile and nod, playing the part of the grateful immigrant who was lucky to be included. I watched my son develop the same unconscious prejudices as his father, the same assumption that accented English meant limited intelligence, that foreign-born meant foreign-minded. I'd created a monster not just in my marriage, but in my child. 20 years of being smaller, quieter, less than I was. 20 years of watching opportunities pass by while I played house with a man who loved me best when I was diminished. 20 years of teaching my son that his mother was intellectually inferior. But not 21 years, never 21 years. The rejection letter was yellowed with age, hidden in Michael's old college files. I'd found it years ago while looking for tax documents, but its significance only hit me now. "Dear Mr. Coleman, we regret to inform you that your application to the Columbia University graduate program in international business has been denied." Columbia, the same university where I'd earned my PhD, the same institution he'd later dismissed as elitist and out of touch with real-world needs. He'd applied the year before we met, desperate to elevate his mediocre marketing career with an Ivy League degree. They'd rejected him. Then he'd met me, a Columbia graduate, summa cum laude, youngest in my program. The irony was devastating. I remembered now how his questions about my education had felt like genuine interest at first. Where did I go to school? What was my dissertation about? Who were my professors? I'd answered eagerly, thrilled to find someone who seemed fascinated by my academic journey. But his interest had an edge I'd been too love-struck to recognize. He wasn't admiring my achievements, he was cataloging them, studying them, preparing to neutralize them. "You must have worked so hard," he'd said early in our relationship. "All those years buried in books, instead of living life. Don't you sometimes wonder what you missed?" He'd planted seeds of doubt so skillfully. Was I too academic, too serious? Had I sacrificed my femininity for intellectual pursuits? Was that why I was still single at 25 while other women my age were married and starting families? The campaign to diminish me had been methodical. At faculty gatherings, he'd introduce me as his brilliant girlfriend, but with a tone that made brilliance sound like a character flaw. When I'd engage in academic discussions, he'd touch my arm and say, "Elena's showing off again," as if intelligence were a party trick rather than who I was. He'd started correcting my English almost immediately, despite the fact that I spoke it better than he did. My accent became something to be ashamed of rather than celebrated. My precise vocabulary was pretentious. My multilingual code switching was confusing. Americans appreciate straightforward communication. He'd lecture me. All those fancy words just make people uncomfortable. But the most insidious manipulation was how he'd convinced me that my success threatened our relationship. He'd sulk when I received recognition, withdraw affection when I'd accomplished something significant, make passive-aggressive comments about career women who put ambition before family. "I just want a wife who's present," he'd say, "someone who prioritizes our relationship over some abstract academic achievement." He'd made me believe I had to choose love or career, marriage or education, being his wife or being myself, and because I'd never had a serious relationship before, because I'd spent so many years focused on my studies, I'd believed him. The UN job offer had been the final test. 3 days after Michael proposed, the position came through senior translator, based in New York with rotating assignments in Geneva, Vienna, and various global hotspots. It was everything I dreamed of, the culmination of years of preparation. Michael's reaction had been swift and devastating. "So this is what matters to you," he'd said, holding the offer letter like it was contaminated. "Some job is more important than our future together." "It's not just some job, Michael. It's the opportunity of a lifetime. For who? For you, maybe. But what about us? What about the family we're planning? You'd rather chase around the world translating for strangers than build a life with the man who loves you?" He'd made it an ultimatum, without explicitly saying so. The ring or the job, marriage or career, love or ambition. I can't build a life with a woman who doesn't prioritize our relationship. He'd said, "If this job is more important than us, then maybe we're not right for each other." 22 years old and desperately in love, I'd chosen him. I'd called the UN and declined the position, watching my future crystallize into something smaller, more contained, more manageable for a man who couldn't handle being married to someone more accomplished than himself. The pattern had continued throughout our marriage. When I'd mentioned potentially teaching at the local community college, he'd worried about the time commitment. When I'd suggested volunteering as a translator for immigrant services, he'd fretted about the emotional drain. When I'd proposed starting a freelance translation business, he'd questioned whether we really needed the complications. Every door to my professional life, he'd found a reason to close, but he'd been smart about it, never explicitly forbidding me from anything. Instead, he'd made each opportunity feel selfish, impractical, threatening to our family stability. He'd positioned himself as the reasonable one, just looking out for our best interests. "I'm not saying you can't," he'd always say. "I'm just saying we should think about whether it's the right time." The right time never came. Jake had absorbed all of this, watching his father's subtle dismissals, learning that his mother's ideas weren't worth taking seriously. He'd seen Michael explain things to me that I already understood, interrupt me when I spoke, make decisions without consulting me. He'd internalized the message that intelligence in women was something to be managed, contained, minimized. Now, standing in our kitchen with my diploma and UN badge as evidence, I saw it all clearly. Michael hadn't fallen in love with my mind, he'd been threatened by it. He hadn't wanted to build me up, he'd systematically torn me down. And I'd been so desperate to be loved that I'd let him do it. 20 years of his insecurity masquerading as protection. 20 years of his fear disguised as concern. 20 years of making myself smaller so he could feel bigger. No more. My thesis draft lay buried beneath 20 years of accumulated household documents, tax returns, medical records, school reports. The pages were slightly yellowed, but the words were still crisp, Evolution of Romance Languages in Immigrant Communities, a longitudinal study of linguistic adaptation and cultural preservation. 467 pages of original research that had taken me 3 years to complete. My professor, Dr. Margaret Chen, had called it groundbreaking. The Defense Committee had unanimously approved it. 3 publishers had expressed interest, and I'd hidden it away like a shameful secret. I carried the manuscript to the kitchen table, my hands trembling slightly as I opened to the introduction. The academic language flowed like poetry after years of stunted conversation. I'd forgotten how it felt to read my own sophisticated thoughts, to see my complex ideas laid out with precision and elegance. Language death occurs not through sudden abandonment, but through gradual erosion, a process accelerated when speakers internalize shame about their linguistic heritage. I'd written 23 years ago. How prophetic, how devastatingly personal. My research had focused on 3 generations of Romance language speakers in New York Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese families. I'd interviewed grandparents who spoke only their native tongues, parents who code-switched between languages, and children who often understood but rarely spoke their ancestral languages. But the most heartbreaking cases were the ones I discovered later in my research: educated immigrants who possessed native fluency, but deliberately adopted broken English to seem less threatening, more approachable, more grateful to be in America. I'd interviewed a Peruvian doctor who spoke like a child when addressing his American colleagues, a Spanish literature professor who pretended to struggle with English grammar at parent-teacher conferences, a Mexican engineer who'd trained herself to mispronounce technical terms she knew perfectly well. Code switching, I'd written, can become code hiding when speakers feel compelled to mask their linguistic competence, to navigate social hierarchies. I'd documented this phenomenon without realizing I'd become a case study. Over the years, I'd continued my research in secret, during Jake's nap times when he was little, late at night after Michael fell asleep, in stolen moments when my family thought I was doing laundry or cleaning. I'd maintained correspondence with former colleagues, followed academic journals, even attended virtual conferences under fake names. My computer had folders within folders of linguistic research, all password protected, and buried in mundane directories. Grocery lists contained analyses of morphological changes in immigrant Spanish. Recipe collection held my ongoing study of English interference in heritage language maintenance. I'd been conducting a longitudinal study of my self-tracking, my own linguistic deterioration, documenting the systematic dismantling of my professional identity. What I'd discovered was horrifying. Language shapes thought. When I forced myself to use simplified vocabulary, my thinking became simpler. When I avoided complex grammatical structures, my ability to process complex ideas atrophied. When I stopped engaging with academic material openly, my intellectual confidence withered. I'd given myself a form of linguistic lobotomy. The research had a name for what I'd experienced: strategic heritage language concealment. Highly educated immigrants who deliberately performed linguistic incompetence to avoid threatening native speakers or being seen as uppity or trying too hard to fit in. The psychological costs were severe: depression, anxiety, identity fragmentation, imposter syndrome. I'd exhibited every symptom while convincing myself I was just being a good wife and mother. My most damning finding had been about children of SHLC parents. They often developed unconscious biases against multilingualism, viewing accented English as a sign of intellectual limitation. They struggled with identity formation, caught between languages they couldn't access and a culture they didn't fully understand. Jake's essay dismissing bilingual education wasn't teenage rebellion. It was a predictable outcome of my choices, but there was hope in my research too. I'd found that SHLC was reversible. Adults who reclaimed their linguistic identities experienced cognitive renaissance, emotional healing, improved family relationships. Their children, initially confused, ultimately developed pride in their heritage and stronger multicultural identities. The return to authentic linguistic expression I'd written in my most recent private paper represents not just personal recovery, but cultural reclamation. Dr. Chen had emailed me just 6 months ago, not knowing about my domestic situation. Columbia was launching a new research initiative on immigrant identity and language maintenance. They needed someone with my expertise to lead the project. The salary would be substantial, the research groundbreaking, the impact global. I deleted the email without responding. Now, I retrieved it from my trash folder and read it again. Dr. Chen remembered my work, respected my expertise, wanted my voice in academic conversations that shaped policy and understanding. Elena, she'd written, your research changed how we think about language and identity. The field needs your perspective now more than ever. The field, my field, the intellectual community I'd abandoned for a man who saw my intelligence as a character flaw to be managed rather than a gift to be celebrated. I opened a new document and began typing a response. My fingers moved quickly, confidently, as years of suppressed academic voice poured onto the screen. I wrote in English perfect, precise, doctorate-level English that would have made Michael cringe. Dear Dr. Chen, I began. I apologize for my delayed response. I would be honored to discuss the research initiative. Jake's essay was tucked inside his English folder, which I'd found while looking for his report card. The title made my heart sink. Why America should be English only. The problems with bilingual education. I sat at his desk and read every devastating word. Bilingual education is a waste of taxpayer money that holds back immigrant children from becoming real Americans. He'd written, instead of learning proper English, they get stuck speaking their parents' languages that won't help them succeed. My mom immigrated from Mexico and still struggles with English after 20 years, which shows how bilingual programs don't work. 20 years of strategic deception. And this was the result. My own son using me as evidence for linguistic prejudice. Kids who speak Spanish at home can't focus on learning English correctly. He continued. They mix up the languages and never master either one. English is the language of business and success in America. If people want to live here, they should speak English perfectly, not expect special treatment for their foreign languages. Foreign languages, as if Spanish wasn't one of the founding languages of this continent, as if millions of Americans hadn't spoken it for generations before English arrived. The essay was well written. I had to admit, Jake had inherited my facility with language and Michael's confidence in expressing opinions. But the content revealed how thoroughly he'd absorbed the toxic messages I'd enabled by hiding my true self. Some people say bilingual education preserves culture, he'd written, but America is already a culture. Immigrants should adapt to American culture instead of bringing their old cultures here. When people refuse to speak English properly, it shows they don't really want to be Americans. I closed the essay and stared at Jake's bedroom walls, covered with soccer posters and video game artwork. Photos of him with friends, him with Michael at baseball games, him receiving academic awards. Not a single image that acknowledged his Mexican heritage. Not one book in Spanish. Not one artifact connecting him to my family's rich cultural history. I'd erased myself so completely that my son didn't even know he was half Mexican. He knew we visited my parents occasionally, knew they spoke Spanish, knew I'd grown up in Mexico City, But in his mind, these were foreign curiosities, not integral parts of his own identity. I'd taught him to see my heritage as something quaint and distant rather than something living and vital in his own bloodstream. The cruelest irony was that Jake was naturally gifted with languages. I'd watched him struggle through mandatory Spanish classes while I sat at parent-teacher conferences, nodding along as teachers explained his difficulties. He could have been fluent in weeks with proper instruction. Instead, he'd internalized the message that Spanish was something foreign and difficult, something that threatened his American identity. Your son seems to have some resistance to the Spanish curriculum, his teacher had told me last semester. Many students whose parents aren't fluent find it challenging to engage with the material. I'd nodded sympathetically, while inside I screamed. I could have taught Spanish at the university level. I could have made Jake fluent, bilingual, culturally rich. Instead, I'd let him struggle and fail, because I was too committed to my performance of limitation. Jake walked in as I was closing his essay folder, backpack slung over his shoulder, earbuds dangling around his neck. "Mom, what are you doing in my room?" For the first time in years, I answered him in Spanish. "Estoy leyendo tu ensayo sobre la educación bilingual." He froze. "What?" I said, "I'm reading your essay about bilingual education." I switched back to English, but the perfect, unaccented English I'd been hiding. "We need to talk. You speak Spanish." His confusion was genuine and heartbreaking. "I'm from Mexico, Jake. Of course I speak Spanish. I also speak it better than most of your Spanish teachers." He sat heavily on his bed, staring at me like I'd revealed I was an alien. "But you always said you didn't understand when Abuela talks fast," I lied. The words hung in the air between us. I've been lying about a lot of things. Why? How could I explain 20 years of self-diminishment to a 17-year-old? How could I make him understand that I'd sacrificed my identity to maintain a marriage, inadvertently teaching him to devalue everything I actually was? Because I thought it would make things easier. I said finally, I thought if I seemed less intimidating, less foreign, less educated, your father would be more comfortable. I thought our family would be happier. But Dad always says, your father says many things that aren't true. I pulled out my Columbia diploma from my purse, including that I barely finished high school. Jake stared at the diploma like it was written in hieroglyphics. "You have a PhD in linguistics." I specialized in exactly the kind of bilingual education you wrote that essay about. "I don't understand." "I know you don't. That's my fault." I sat beside him on the bed. "Jake, everything you wrote in that essay is wrong. Not opinion wrong, but factually wrong. Bilingual education enhances cognitive development. Multilingual individuals have better problem-solving skills, enhanced creativity, delayed onset of dementia. But you always struggle with English." "I don't struggle with English. I have a doctorate in linguistics from Columbia University. I speak 8 languages fluently. I was offered a position with the United Nations as a translator." I pulled out the badge, the rejection letter that had revealed Michael's insecurities, the thesis that proved my expertise. "I've been pretending to be less than I am." Jake picked up my thesis, flipping through pages of academic language that proved everything he thought he knew about his mother was false. "So when you couldn't help me with Spanish homework, I could have taught you Spanish in a month. I could have made you fluent in multiple languages. Instead, I let you believe that bilingualism was a disadvantage, that your heritage was something to be ashamed of." His face crumpled with confusion and anger. "Why would you do that?" "Because I was a coward," I said simply, "and because I thought protecting your father's ego was more important than protecting your identity." My language certification certificates were stored in a fireproof box in the garage, each one representing years of study and thousands of hours of practice. I spread them across the kitchen table like evidence in a trial. Spanish native fluency, English Cambridge Certificate of Proficiency, French DELF C2, Italian SIL C2, Portuguese Self-Brass Advanced, German Goethe Certificate C2, Mandarin, Level 6, and Arabic ALT Advanced. 8 languages, 8 different ways of seeing the world, thinking about concepts, expressing ideas, 8 cultural doorways I'd closed for 20 years. Michael and Jake stood in the kitchen doorway, staring at the certificates like they were looking at someone else's life. "This is impossible," Michael said finally. "You can barely handle English." I picked up the phone and dialed my parents' number in Mexico City. When my mother answered, I spoke rapid Spanish, explaining the situation, asking her to play along with what I was about to do. "Mama, necesito que hables conmigo por unos minutos en español." Michael y Jake están aquí. Y van a escuchar una conversation real, por primera vez en 20 años. My mother's shock was audible even from the speaker. She'd been begging me for decades to stop the charade, to speak naturally with my family. Now she launched into an emotional monologue about how proud she was of my education, how heartbroken she'd been watching me diminish myself, how she'd never understood why I pretended not to speak English well when I'd been the most articulate person she knew since childhood. Jake's mouth fell open. Michael turned pale. I hung up and immediately called my colleague from graduate school, Dr. Marie Dubois, who now taught at the Sorbonne. We spoke in rapid French about recent developments in computational linguistics, discussing technical concepts that would have been challenging even for native speakers. "Elena, ma chérie," Marie laughed through the phone. "I was beginning to think you disappeared entirely from academic life. Your insights on morphological variation are still being cited in current research." Next, I called my former roommate Isabella, who worked as a simultaneous interpreter in Rome. Our Italian conversation flowed like music, full of complex subjunctive constructions and regional idioms that I'd learned during a summer research trip to Sicily. Portuguese came next, with a call to Professor João Santos in Sao Paulo, who'd collaborated with me on a paper about linguistic interference patterns. We discussed recent changes in Brazilian Portuguese pronunciation that reflected social media influence on language evolution. Michael sank into a chair. Jake remained standing, frozen in disbelief. For German, I recited from memory passages from Goethe and Kafka, then explained in academic German the phonological differences between Austrian, Swiss, and Standard German dialects. My pronunciation was crisp, my grammar flawless, my vocabulary sophisticated. The Mandarin demonstration was visual as well as auditory. I wrote complex characters on paper while explaining tonal variations and their semantic implications. I recited classical poetry and modern news headlines with equal fluency, switching between traditional and simplified characters seamlessly. Finally, Arabic. I began with formal modern standard Arabic, reading from a newspaper article about Middle Eastern politics, then switched to Egyptian dialect, followed by Levantine, and finished with Maghrebi Arabic from my time studying North African literature. Each Arabic dialect, I explained in perfect English, represents different historical influences, trade relationships, and cultural exchanges. Understanding Arabic isn't just about language, it's about comprehending 14 centuries of Islamic civilization, scientific advancement, and literary achievement. The silence in our kitchen was deafening. "Who are you?" Jake whispered. "I'm your mother," I said. "The same person I've always been, except now you're seeing me without the mask I've worn for 20 years. Michael was staring at his hands. You speak better English than I do. Yes. You always spoke better English than me. Yes. You have advanced degrees in languages I can't even identify. Yes. You could have been anything: diplomat, professor, translator, consultant. I was offered all of those positions at various times. I turned them down. Jake picked up my Arabic certificate, studying the calligraphy he couldn't read. Why didn't you teach me any of these languages? Because your father convinced me that being multilingual would confuse you, hold you back, make you seem foreign. I looked directly at Michael because I believed that making myself smaller would make our marriage stronger. But you speak 8 languages. Jake's voice cracked with emotion. Do you know what I could do with 8 languages? Do you know what doors that would open? The same doors I closed for myself. Michael finally looked up. I never asked you to. You didn't have to ask. You made it clear every day that my intelligence threatened you, that my education was something to be managed rather than celebrated. I gathered my certificates into a neat stack. Every time you corrected my English, you were correcting someone with a PhD in linguistics. Every time you explained something to me like I was a child, you were talking down to someone more educated than yourself. Every time you made me feel ashamed of my accent, you were shaming someone who spoke your language better than you do. Jake was looking through my thesis now, pages of sophisticated analysis that proved everything he thought he knew about language learning was wrong. Mom, this research, it's incredible. It completely contradicts everything I wrote in that essay. Your essay wasn't your fault, I said gently. You wrote what you'd been taught to believe, but now you know the truth. Michael stood abruptly. I need some air. As he headed for the door, I called after him in Spanish. La verdad siempre sale a la luz, Michael. The truth always comes to light. He paused at the threshold, his shoulders sagging with the weight of 20 years of lies, finally revealed. Jake looked at me with new eyes. Will you teach me? All of them? If you want to learn. I want to learn everything, he said quietly. I want to know who my mother really is. The UN job offer letter was still in its original envelope, postmarked June 18, 2003. I'd kept it all these years, reading it whenever I needed to remember who I'd been before I became who Michael wanted me to be. Dear Dr. Rodriguez, it began. We are pleased to offer you the position of Senior Translator, Romance Languages Division, United Nations Conference Services. Your starting salary will be $78.00 annually, with standard diplomatic benefits including housing allowances for international assignments. $78,000 in 2003, equivalent to over $120,000 today. More than Michael had ever earned in his best year at the marketing firm, where he'd worked for the past 15 years. Jake read over my shoulder, his eyes widening at the figures. Mom, this is incredible money. It wasn't about the money, I said, though watching his reaction made me realize how naive I'd been. It was about the work, conference interpretation, document translation, diplomatic communication. I would have been the voice between nations, helping world leaders understand each other. The position description read like a dream job I'd never dared to imagine. Rotating assignments between New York headquarters and international offices in Geneva, Vienna, and Nairobi. Translation of treaties, resolutions, and diplomatic correspondence in Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, and Arabic. Simultaneous interpretation during General Assembly sessions and Security Council meetings. You would have traveled the world, Jake said quietly. We would have traveled the world. UN employees get education allowances for their children. You could have attended international schools, learned multiple languages naturally, had friends from every continent. Instead, Jake had grown up in suburban Connecticut, never traveling further than Disney World, convinced that multilingualism was a disadvantage rather than the greatest gift I could have given him. I pulled out my laptop and showed him the UN translator website. Current job postings required exactly the qualifications I'd possessed 20 years ago: advanced degrees in linguistics, fluency in multiple languages, cultural competency, international experience. They're hiring now, I said, scrolling through positions. Senior positions, $95,000 to $140,000. Based in New York, Geneva, or Vienna. You could still apply. I'm 42, Jake. I've been out of professional practice for 20 years, but you never stopped studying. All those late nights, when I thought you were cleaning, you were researching, maintaining your skills, staying current with linguistic theory. He was right. My secret academic life had kept me professionally viable even while I was personally diminished. The freelance translation work had maintained my technical skills. My hidden correspondence with colleagues had kept me connected to developments in the field. Besides, Jake continued, look at this. He'd found the biographical page for the current director of translation services, Dr. Patricia Williams, appointed 2019. Previously spent 15 years as a stay-at-home mother before returning to academic life and joining the UN system. A stay-at-home mother who'd made it to the top of the UN translation hierarchy. Proof that career gaps didn't have to be career killers. Michael's voice came from behind us. You're seriously considering this? I turned to face him. He looked haggard, older than his 45 years, as if the revelation of my true identity had aged him overnight. I'm considering a lot of things. Michael, Elena, you can't just... We have a life here, a mortgage, responsibilities. Jake's college applications would be strengthened by having a mother who works for the United Nations rather than one who supposedly cleans houses for grocery money. Michael's face flushed. He'd never questioned where my small contributions to household income came from, content to believe I performed menial labor while he handled the real career. You don't understand the financial implications, he said. UN jobs are temporary contracts, no stability, constant travel. Michael, I've been reading UN employment contracts for 20 years. They offer more stability than your marketing job, better benefits, and international opportunities. The temporary contracts are renewable and often lead to permanent positions. But what about Jake's senior year? His college prep? Jake looked between us. Dad, she's talking about one of the most prestigious career opportunities in the world. And you're worried about my senior year of high school. It's not that simple. It is that simple. I interrupted. For 20 years, you found reasons why every professional opportunity was impractical, poorly timed, or threatening to our family stability. But the truth is, you've been afraid that my success would diminish yours. Michael sat heavily at the kitchen table. That's not. I never meant. You meant every word, every dismissal, every suggestion that my ambitions were selfish while yours were necessary. I sat across from him, the UN letter between us like a bridge to the life I'd sacrificed. The difference is, I'm done accepting your limitations as mine. So what are you saying? You're going to abandon your family for some career fantasy. I'm saying I'm going to reclaim the career I abandoned for a family that never appreciated the sacrifice. I looked at Jake, who was nodding encouragingly, and I'm going to show my son what it looks like when a woman refuses to make herself smaller for anyone's comfort. Michael stared at the UN letter, perhaps finally understanding what he'd cost me and what I was capable of reclaiming. The application deadline for the next recruitment cycle is in 6 weeks, I said. I'm going to apply, and if you get it, when I get it, I corrected. We'll figure out what comes next. Jake grinned. Mom's family photo had been taken during our last visit to Mexico 3 years ago. In it, I'm laughing with my parents on their patio, speaking animated Spanish, my hands gesturing expressively as I tell a story. I look confident, vibrant, alive in a way I never looked at home in Connecticut. Jake found it while going through photo albums, searching for images of his heritage he'd never been encouraged to explore. You look completely different, he said, studying my face in the picture. Like a different person. That's who I am when I'm allowed to be myself. Starting that morning, I refused to speak anything but perfect English at home. No more dropped articles. No more simplified vocabulary. No more deliberate mispronunciations. If Michael asked me to explain something I'd said, I'd repeat it exactly the same way and suggest he look up any words he didn't understand. The transformation was immediate and unsettling for everyone. Elena, could you pass the salt? Michael asked at dinner. Certainly, I replied in crisp, unaccented English, though you might consider reducing sodium intake given your family history of hypertension. He stared at me like I'd spoken in tongues. Jake, meanwhile, was fascinated. Mom, say something in Spanish. ¿Qué te gustaría que diga? I responded naturally. I don't understand. You asked me to say something in Spanish. I asked what you'd like me to say. I switched back to English. Would you like me to teach you? Yes, everything. Start with basics. So I did. Over dinner, I taught Jake how to introduce himself, how to order food, how to ask for directions. His pronunciation was surprisingly good. He'd inherited my linguistic aptitude, even though it had never been nurtured. Michael ate in increasingly uncomfortable silence as Spanish flowed between us. This is ridiculous, he finally said. We're in America. We should speak English at the dinner table. We are speaking English, Michael. Jake and I are also speaking Spanish. Bilingual families code switch naturally. It's a sign of linguistic sophistication, not confusion. It's rude to speak a language not everyone understands. Then perhaps you should learn Spanish. Jake picked up basic conversational phrases in 20 minutes. I could have you functionally bilingual in 6 months. I don't want to learn Spanish. Then don't complain about not understanding it. The bluntness of my response shocked all of us. For 20 years, I'd apologized for my languages, my accent, my heritage. No more. That evening, Jake asked me to help him with his Spanish homework, something I'd been refusing to do for years, claiming incompetence. This is actually pretty easy when you explain it properly, he said as we worked through conjugations. My teacher makes it seem so complicated. Spanish grammar is more systematic than English grammar. Once you understand the patterns, it's quite logical. I showed him how verb endings indicated person and number, how accent marks clarified meaning, how gender agreements created linguistic precision. Why didn't you ever help me before? Because I was pretending to be someone I'm not, and because your father convinced me that helping you with Spanish would interfere with your English development, which is linguistically nonsense. Michael appeared in the doorway. It's getting late. Jake has school tomorrow. We're studying. Michael, this is homework. He can finish it in study hall. I looked at my husband, really looked at him. For years, I'd seen his interruptions as caring involvement. Now I recognize them as control mechanisms, ways to limit my influence over our son's education and development. Jake and I will decide when we're finished studying. Michael's jaw tightened. Elena, I think you're taking this revelation too far. Yes, you're more educated than you let on, but that doesn't mean you need to completely change how our family operates. Our family has been operating on a foundation of lies for 20 years. I think some changes are overdue. You're being dramatic. I'm being honest. For the first time, into decades. I'm being completely honest about who I am and what I'm capable of. After Michael left, Jake and I continued studying. I taught him about the subjunctive mood, about regional dialects, about the poetry inherent in Romance languages. His eyes lit up with every new concept. Mom, I could have been bilingual this whole time. You still can be. 17 isn't too late to become fluent. Will you really teach me all 8 languages, if you want to learn them? Yes, we'll start with Spanish since it's your heritage language, then move to French and Italian. Portuguese will be easy once you master Spanish. Arabic and Mandarin are more challenging, but perfectly achievable. What about Dad? I considered the question. Your father will need to decide whether he wants to grow with us or remain stuck in the limitation he's created. Jake nodded thoughtfully. He's scared, isn't he, of losing control? Very scared, but that's his fear to manage, not ours to accommodate. That night, I moved my computer to the kitchen table and began working on my UN application in full view of anyone who wanted to see. No more hiding my capabilities. No more pretending my work was insignificant. Michael walked through several times, glancing at my screen, where complex linguistic analysis filled the page. What are you working on? My application essay for the UN position. I'm explaining how my research on heritage language maintenance relates to diplomatic translation work. He read over my shoulder for a moment. I didn't know you could write like this. There are a lot of things you don't know about me, Michael. 20 years of things. I'm beginning to realize that, for the first time since the school conference. His voice held something other than anger or fear. It sounded almost like regret. My business plan materialized over 3 sleepless nights. 20 years of suppressed ambition pouring onto paper with startling clarity. Rodriguez language and cultural consulting, bridging communication gaps in global business. The document was comprehensive market analysis, service offerings, financial projections, competitive landscape. I'd been conducting informal market research for years without realizing it, observing the translation and cultural consulting needs in our community, noting the gaps between what local businesses needed and what they could access. The plan outlined 3 service tiers: document translation, cultural competency training for businesses expanding internationally, and executive language coaching for professionals needing rapid acquisition of conversational skills. My unique selling proposition was obvious: 8 languages, academic credentials, and deep understanding of cultural nuances that most translation services missed. Michael found me at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, laptop open, surrounded by printed market research and financial calculations. Elena, this is insane. You can't start a business. Why not? Because you've never run a business. You don't know anything about marketing, accounting, client management. I have a PhD, Michael. I managed a household budget for 20 years while you focused on your career. I've been running freelance translation projects in secret for 15 years. And unlike your marketing firm, I actually have unique, valuable skills that companies need. He sat across from me, studying the business plan I'd left open on the screen. The financial projections were conservative, but impressive: $50,000 in year 1, scaling to $150, zero by year 3 based on current market rates for specialized linguistic services. These numbers, are these realistic? They're based on actual quotes I've received for projects I couldn't take because I was pretending to be incapable. I showed him a folder of emails I'd saved. This law firm wants Spanish translation services for immigration cases, $75 per page. Minimum 200 pages per month. This medical device company needs cultural consulting for their Latin American expansion, $200 per hour. estimated 40 hours per quarter. Michael's face grew pale as he read through the opportunities I'd been turning down for years. You've been getting job offers this whole time, constantly. The freelance translation work I told you was house cleaning. It was maintaining my professional network. Every former colleague who changed jobs, every professor who started consulting, every UN contact who moved to private sector, they've been sending me referrals. I opened my secret email account, showing him dozens of project inquiries I'd declined. Over the years, legal translations, academic paper editing, business correspondence, technical manuals, literary works, a steady stream of well-paying work I'd refused because I was committed to being the wife he wanted rather than the professional I was. Jesus, Elena, some of these are substantial contracts. This publishing house wanted me to translate a series of contemporary Mexican novels, 12 books, $5,000 each. I told them I wasn't available. I scrolled to another email. This pharmaceutical company needed someone to adapt their clinical trial documentation for Spanish-speaking markets. 6-month contract, $8,000 per month. You turned down $8,000 a month? I turned down hundreds of thousands of dollars in potential income over 20 years because I thought being your supportive wife was more important than being financially independent. Michael stared at the screen in stunned silence. His own salary at the marketing firm was $45,000 annually, less than I could make in 3 months of consulting work. But what about Jake? What about our family responsibilities? Michael, most of this work can be done from home. The consulting requires some travel, but less than your current job. And Jake is 17. He doesn't need constant supervision. He needs a mother who models professional achievement and financial independence. I pulled up the website for a competitor translation service, run by a woman with fewer credentials than mine, charging rates 30% higher than what I'd planned. The market demand is there. I have the skills, the credentials, the network. What I've been missing is the confidence to value my abilities appropriately. And you think you can just start a business just like that? I think I can do anything I set my mind to. I earned a PhD at 25, mastered 8 languages, conducted groundbreaking research while raising a child and managing a household. Starting a consulting business isn't beyond my capabilities. Michael sat back in his chair, the weight of 20 years of underestimation finally hitting him. I had no idea. You had every opportunity to have an idea. You chose not to see what was right in front of you. The next morning, Jake found me updating my LinkedIn profile for the first time in 2 decades. I was adding my education, my language skills, my research experience, the freelance work I'd been hiding. Mom, you have 700 connections already, former colleagues, professors, clients from my secret translation work. I've maintained professional relationships even while pretending not to have professional capabilities. Jake watched me upload my thesis abstract, my conference presentations, my published papers. Each addition to my profile felt like reclaiming a piece of my identity that had been buried for too long. This is incredible. You're like academically famous in linguistic circles. Yes, my research on heritage language maintenance has been cited over 300 times, and Dad never knew. Your father never asked. He was content to believe I was intellectually limited as long as it made him feel superior. Within hours of updating my profile, the messages started coming. Former colleagues celebrating my return to professional visibility, potential clients asking about availability, academic institutions inviting me to speak at conferences. Dr. Chen from Colombia sent a particularly exciting message. Elena, so glad to see you're professionally active again. The research initiative I mentioned is still available, and after seeing your updated profile, I'm even more convinced you're perfect for it. Are you available for a call this week? Michael saw me responding to professional inquiries, and his panic was visible. You're really doing this. You're really going back to work. I never stopped working, Michael. I just stopped being honest about the work I was doing. But our life, our routine was based on me being small and you being important. That routine is over. Jake looked up from his homework, Spanish homework. I was now helping him with openly. Mom, this is awesome. My mom is like a professional badass, and I never even knew. Language, Jake, Michael said automatically. Cue language, Papa, Jake responded in Spanish, grinning at me. Michael's world was crumbling, and mine was finally beginning to rebuild. The conference speaking invitation arrived from the International Association of Translation and Interpreting Studies, their most prestigious annual conference. The subject line made my hands tremble. Keynote speaker invitation. Dr. Elena Rodriguez. Dr. Rodriguez. The email began. Your groundbreaking research on strategic heritage language concealment has transformed our understanding of immigrant linguistic identity. We would be honored to have you deliver the opening keynote at our conference in San Francisco next month. The theme is Authentic Voices in a Globalized World, and your perspective would be invaluable to our international audience of 2,000 linguistic professionals. 2,000 professionals. A keynote address. Recognition of research I'd been conducting in secret for 20 years. The speaking fee was substantial, $15,000 plus expenses, more than Michael earned in 4 months. But the professional recognition was worth infinitely more. Jake read the invitation over my shoulder. Mom, this is huge. They want you to be the main speaker at an international conference. I know. My voice was barely a whisper. I can't believe it. You have to say yes. I haven't given a presentation in 20 years, Jake. I don't know if I can. Mom, he turned to face me directly. You just demonstrated fluency in 8 languages. You wrote a doctoral thesis that people are still citing. You've been conducting research while pretending to clean houses. You can definitely give a presentation. He was right. The fear wasn't about my capabilities, it was about stepping fully into the professional identity I'd abandoned once I accepted this invitation. There would be no going back to being Michael's diminished wife. I typed my response. I would be honored to deliver the keynote address. Please send me the conference details and presentation requirements. Michael's reaction was explosive. Absolutely not. You are not flying to San Francisco to give some academic lecture. I'm not asking for permission. Michael, I'm informing you of my decision. Elena, this is ridiculous. You've lost perspective completely. First, the business plan. I wrote that essay about bilingual education being bad because I honestly believed it. But I believed it because I learned to be ashamed of where you came from. And that means I learned to be ashamed of where I came from too. I made fun of kids at school who spoke Spanish with their parents. I rolled my eyes when you talked to Abuela on the phone. I was embarrassed when you didn't understand things that I now know you understood better than anyone. The next paragraph made my eyes fill with tears. I'm not just sorry for being wrong about bilingual education. I'm sorry for being the kind of person who would look down on people like you, like us. I'm sorry for letting Dad's attitude become my attitude. I'm sorry for making you feel like you had to hide who you really are. But mostly, I'm sorry that you felt like you had to choose between being yourself and being my mom. He'd signed it. Con amor y respeto. To Hijo Jake. With love and respect, your son Jake. The Spanish was imperfect, but genuine. I found him in the kitchen, nervously eating cereal and checking his phone every few seconds. I read your letter, and I pulled him into a hug, something that had become rare as he'd grown into typical teenage independence. And I forgive you completely. But more importantly, I'm proud of you for recognizing what happened and taking responsibility for your part in it. I feel like such an idiot. All those times I complained about having to take Spanish class, and you could have been teaching me at home. You weren't an idiot, Jake. You were a child absorbing the messages the adults around you were sending. That's not your fault. We sat together at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd been hiding my true self for 17 years. Can I ask you something? Jake said. Were you happy? All those years pretending to be someone else? The question cut straight to the heart of everything. No, Mio. I wasn't happy. I thought I was doing the right thing for our family. But I was slowly dying inside. Why didn't you just stop? Why didn't you just be yourself? Because by the time I realized what I'd lost, I didn't know how to get it back without destroying everything we'd built. I was afraid that if I revealed who I really was, your father would leave, or you'd be angry that I'd been lying, or our whole family would fall apart. But our family was already falling apart, wasn't it? I mean, it was built on lies. Yes, I see that now. Jake picked at his cereal, thinking. I've been reading about bilingual education online. Real research, not just opinion articles. Mom, the benefits are incredible. Bilingual kids score higher on cognitive tests, have better problem-solving skills, are more creative. They're less likely to develop dementia when they're older. I know. I've been researching it for 20 years. And I could have had all of that. We could have had all of that. You still can. Jake, who's 17, isn't too late to become truly bilingual. Your brain is still developing language centers. With intensive work, you could be fluent in Spanish within a year. His eyes lit up. Really? Really? And once you master Spanish, the other Romance languages will come easily. French, Italian, Portuguese, they're all related. You could be multilingual. By the time you graduate college, will you teach me? I mean, really teach me, not just help with homework. If you're serious about learning, yes, but it will require commitment, daily practice, grammar study, cultural immersion. I'm serious. I want to connect with that part of my heritage. I want to be able to talk to Abuela properly, not just nod and smile when she speaks fast. What about your father? How do you think he'll react to you becoming bilingual? Jake was quiet for a moment. I think Dad's scared that if I become more like you, I'll look down on him the way he looked down on you. And will you? I don't want to, but I'm already starting to see things differently, like the way he interrupts you when you're talking, or explains things you obviously already know. It's embarrassing, Jake. Your father isn't a bad man. He's insecure and controlling, but he's not evil. He's learning to, in his own way. You going to divorce him? The directness of the question surprised me. I don't know. That depends on whether he can accept and respect the woman I actually am, not the woman I pretended to be. What if he can't? Then I'll build a life with people who can. Jake nodded solemnly. I want you to know that I can accept you. I mean, the real you. And I'm excited to get to know her. She's been here all along, Mio. She was just hiding. That afternoon, we started Spanish lessons in earnest. I pulled out materials I'd been secretly developing for years: comprehensive grammar guides, cultural context lessons, conversation practice exercises. Jake was a quick learner, his pronunciation improving dramatically once I corrected the errors his school Spanish teacher had been reinforcing. Why is Spanish grammar actually easier than English grammar in some ways? He asked as we worked through verb conjugations. Because Spanish follows more consistent rules. English borrowed from so many languages that it's full of irregularities and exceptions. So when people say Spanish is hard, they usually mean it's different from English. But different doesn't mean harder. As we studied, I watched Jake's enthusiasm grow. He wasn't just learning vocabulary and grammar, he was discovering a part of his identity that had been systematically suppressed. Mom, can we call Abuela? I want to try speaking Spanish with her. I dialed my mother's number, my heart full of hope and anticipation. Abuela, Jake said carefully when she answered. Soy Jake. Estoy aprendiendo español con mi mamá. My mother's gasp of joy was audible even through the phone. She began speaking slowly and clearly, encouraging Jake, praising his pronunciation, expressing years of pent-up excitement about finally being able to communicate with her grandson. After the call, Jake looked at me with new understanding. She's been waiting 17 years to have a real conversation with me, hasn't she? Yes, but she never gave up hope. Just like you never gave up being who you really are, even when you were hiding it. Exactly. Mom, yes, I'm proud to be your son, all of you. The PhD professor, and the UN translator, and the polyglot and the researcher. I'm proud of all of it. It was the validation I'd been waiting 20 years to hear. Michael discovered my hidden bank account by accident while looking for tax documents. The statement showed a balance that made him go pale. $127,000 in savings accumulated. Over 15 years of secret freelance translation work, Elena. His voice was tight with controlled anger when he confronted me that evening. We need to talk about this bank account. I looked at the statement in his hands. What about it? You've been hiding money from me for years. I've been saving money from work you didn't know I was doing. There's a difference. This is marital assets, Elena. You can't just hide financial accounts from your spouse. You mean like how you've been hiding your investment losses from me? I pulled out my laptop and showed him what I'd discovered while researching our finances. For my business plan, your retirement account is down 40% from where you claimed it was. You've been gambling on day trading and losing our money for 3 years. His face went red. That's different. I'm trying to improve our financial situation by lying about losses and hiding financial information from me while simultaneously criticizing me for doing the same thing. Your secret account is different because you earned that money under false pretenses. You told me you were cleaning houses. I told you I was working for extra income. I never specified the nature of the work. Don't parse words with me, Elena. I'm not parsing words. I'm being precise with language, something you should appreciate, given that precision is apparently threatening to you. Michael sat heavily in his chair. The bank statement crumpled in his hands. $127,000. That's 3 years of my salary. Yes, money you made while pretending to be barely competent. Money I made because I'm extremely competent, regardless of what I was pretending. The full scope of his financial inadequacy was finally hitting him. Not only was I more educated and professionally accomplished than he'd known, I was also more financially successful. The power dynamic he'd spent 20 years carefully constructing was completely inverted. You've been planning this, he said, quietly. The business, the conferences, the UN application. You've been planning to leave me. I've been planning to become financially independent so I'd have choices. Whether the first exercise those choices depends entirely on whether our marriage can evolve beyond the toxic dynamic we've been trapped in. So this is, what, an ultimatum? It's a reality check. For 20 years, Jake had flown out with me. His first trip to California, his first time seeing his mother in a professional context. Michael had stayed home, claiming work obligations, though we both knew he wasn't ready to witness my public triumph. Mom, you look amazing, Jake whispered as we waited in the wings. I was wearing my best suit, The one I'd bought years ago for job interviews I never attended. Paired with the pearl necklace, my grandmother had given me a piece of my heritage I'd hidden away like everything else. The applause began as my name was announced. I walked onto the stage, looking out at an audience that represented the professional community I'd abandoned 20 years ago. These were my peers, my colleagues, the people who understood the value of what I'd sacrificed. Buenos dias, good morning, bonjour, buongiorno, bom dia, guten morgen, I began, greeting the audience in all 8 of my languages. Today, I want to tell you about a woman who spoke 8 languages fluently, but convinced her family she could barely handle one. The presentation flowed naturally. 20 years of suppressed expertise, pouring out in a carefully structured narrative. I explained strategic heritage language concealment using myself as the primary case study, tracing my journey from UN translator candidate to academic professor to domesticated housewife who pretended to clean homes for grocery money. Language is power, I told the audience. When we allow ourselves to be diminished linguistically, we accept diminishment in every other area of our lives. When we hide our multilingual competence, we teach our children that their heritage is something to be ashamed of rather than celebrated. I showed slides of my research data anonymous surveys from highly educated immigrants who'd adopted strategic heritage language concealment, their children's attitudes toward multilingualism, the long-term psychological and economic costs of linguistic self-suppression. The woman I'm describing, the PhD who pretended to be barely educated, the polyglot who spoke broken English at home, the expert who deferred to her monolingual husband's inferior knowledge. That woman was me. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. For 20 years, I made myself smaller to make others more comfortable. I taught my son that intelligence in women was threatening, that accented English indicated limited thinking, that multilingualism was a burden rather than a gift. I nearly destroyed my own identity to preserve a marriage based on false hierarchy. I explained the catless Jake's comment at the school conference, the teacher's shock, the moment when my carefully constructed facade finally cracked. The question this research raises is not why educated immigrants hide their capabilities. The social pressures are well documented. The question is how we create environments where linguistic authenticity is celebrated rather than punished, where multilingual competence is seen as professional enhancement rather than social threat. The solutions I proposed were both systemic and personal. Workplace policies that value multilingual skills, educational programs that celebrate heritage languages, community support networks for linguistic reclamation, and individual strategies for overcoming internalized shame about cultural identity. To the highly educated immigrants in this audience who are hiding your light, I said, looking directly into the crowd, your silence serves no one. Your diminishment helps no one. Your children need to see you as you really are: brilliant, capable, multilingual, valuable. I concluded with my current transformation, the business launch, the UN application, the academic re-engagement, and most importantly, my son's journey from linguistic prejudice to heritage pride. Strategic heritage language concealment is reversible, I said. Professional identity is recoverable. Family relationships can heal when built on authenticity rather than performance. But the first step is refusing to be smaller than you are. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes as I looked out at the audience: researchers, translators, professors, consultants. I felt something I hadn't experienced in 20 years: professional belonging. During the Q&A, the questions were sophisticated and engaged. A professor from MIT asked about intervention strategies for children of SHLC parents. A translator from the EU wanted to know about workplace applications. A researcher from Tokyo inquired about cross-cultural variations in the phenomenon. I answered each question with confidence and expertise, drawing on research I'd been conducting in secret, insights I'd been afraid to share, knowledge I'd been told was threatening rather than valuable. After the presentation, I was surrounded by colleagues wanting to collaborate, students seeking research opportunities, professionals requesting consulting services, business cards, email addresses, project proposals. The professional network I'd abandoned was welcoming me back with enthusiasm. Jake watched all of this with pride and amazement. Mom, they're treating you like a celebrity, not a celebrity. A respected expert in my field, Dr. Chen from Colombia, approached us, beaming. Elena, that was extraordinary, powerful and personal, and professionally brilliant. The UN research position is yours if you want it. I want it. And I have 3 other institutions asking if you're available for collaborative projects. Jake grinned. My mom is in demand. That evening, as we walked along Fisherman's Wharf, Jake asked, "How does it feel, being yourself professionally again? Terrifying and exhilarating, and right?" I said, "Like I've been holding my breath for 20 years, and finally remembered how to breathe." Dad would have been proud if he'd seen you today. Maybe. Or maybe he would have been threatened by seeing how much I've been capable of all along. Either way, I'm proud of you. And I'm proud to be your son. Standing there watching the sunset over San Francisco Bay, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was 25 years old. Unlimited possibility. The future stretched before me like an open horizon, full of professional opportunities, personal growth, and authentic relationships. I was no longer hiding my light. I was finally ready to shine. The language learning at progress report showed Jake's dedication in stock numbers: 847 consecutive days of Spanish practice, 312 hours of audio lessons, vocabulary mastery at intermediate level, and most remarkably, cultural lessons completed for every Spanish-speaking country in the Americas. He downloaded Duolingo the day after I revealed my true identity. But that was just the beginning. He'd also enrolled in online conversation classes with native speakers, joined Spanish language social media groups, and started watching Mexican and Spanish films with subtitles that he gradually turned off as his comprehension improved. "Mira, Mama," he said, showing me his phone screen filled with Spanish notifications. "Estoy leyendo las noticias en español ahora." His pronunciation was nearly perfect now, his grammar solid, his confidence growing daily. More importantly, he was developing the cultural competency that had been systematically stripped away. During his childhood, "Jake, your Spanish is better than most of my college students after 2 years of study." I had motivation they didn't have. I was learning about myself, not just learning a language. The transformation went beyond linguistics. Jake had reached out to my parents independently, asking them to teach him about Mexican history, family traditions, cultural practices he'd never been exposed to. He'd started cooking Mexican food, learning traditional recipes from my mother via video calls. "Abuela taught me to make mole yesterday," he announced, showing me photos of his kitchen experiment. "It took 6 hours, and I burned the first batch. But the second attempt was actually edible. Your grandmother must have been thrilled," she cried. "Mom, like actual tears. She said she'd been waiting 17 years for me to ask about family recipes." The cultural reclamation was profound. Jake's bedroom now featured a Mexican flag alongside his American one, photos of our extended family in Mexico City, books about Mexican literature and history. He'd even started writing a research paper about the Mexican-American War for his AP history class, exploring perspectives he'd never considered before. But the most significant change was in his attitude toward multilingualism and cultural diversity. The boy who'd written essays dismissing bilingual education was now advocating for expanded language programs at his school. I talked to my guidance counselor about adding more Spanish literature classes. He told me over dinner, and I suggested they offer credit for heritage language speakers who want to develop academic literacy in their family languages. What did she say? She was interested. Apparently, several students have parents who speak other languages, but the kids never developed full fluency. They could create a whole program around heritage language reclamation. Michael listened to our conversation with an expression I couldn't quite read. Over the past month, he'd been making efforts to understand the changes in our family dynamics. But Jake's rapid development in Spanish seemed to highlight his own linguistic limitations. I've been thinking, Michael said carefully. Maybe I should learn Spanish too. Jake's progress is impressive, and I feel left out when you two are talking. Jake's face lit up. Really, Dad? I could help you. I know all the basics now. I'd appreciate that. It was a small gesture, but significant. Michael was acknowledging that multilingualism was valuable rather than threatening, that Jake's bilingual development was something to celebrate rather than suppress. Jake's been researching colleges with strong international programs, I mentioned. He's particularly interested in schools that offer study abroad opportunities in Spanish-speaking countries. I want to spend a semester in Mexico, Jake confirmed. Maybe work with Abuelo's construction company. See what business is like there. Practice Spanish in a professional context. Michael nodded slowly. That sounds educational. More than educational, Dad. It sounds like becoming the person I should have been all along if we hadn't been so afraid of my heritage. The comment hung in the air. Jake wasn't being cruel, but he was being direct about the cost of our family's linguistic suppression. You're right, Michael said quietly. We were afraid. I was afraid. That weekend, Jake asked me to help him write a letter to his Spanish teacher, explaining his family situation and requesting permission to do an independent study project on strategic heritage language concealment. I want to interview other students who might be experiencing what I experienced, he explained. Kids who understand heritage languages but don't speak them, or who feel ashamed of their parents' accents, or who've been told that bilingualism is confusing. That's advanced research for a high school student. I have an expert consultant, he said, grinning at me. My mom, the PhD. The letter he wrote was sophisticated and thoughtful, explaining how discovering his mother's true identity had changed his understanding of language, culture, and family dynamics. His teacher was so impressed that she shared it with the entire language department. Mrs. Patterson wants to know if you'd be willing to speak to her advanced Spanish class. Jake told me about heritage language maintenance and the research you've been doing. You want me to speak at your school. I want my classmates to meet the real you, the brilliant, accomplished, multilingual you, not the version you've been hiding. The speaking opportunity would be another step in my professional reclamation, but more importantly, it would be Jake publicly claiming his heritage and his mother's expertise. I'd be honored to speak to your class. And Mom, I've been thinking about college majors. I want to study linguistics and international business, maybe follow in your footsteps academically, then use those skills in the business world. Jake, that's a fantastic combination. You could work for multinational corporations, international nonprofits, diplomatic services, or I could work with you. When your consulting business expands, you might need a partner who understands both the academic and business sides of language services. The idea of working with my son professionally was thrilling. Jake was developing exactly the combination of skills that would make him valuable in an increasingly globalized economy: linguistic competence, cultural awareness, business acumen, and most importantly, authentic pride in his multicultural identity. We could be Rodriguez Language and Cultural Consulting, LLC, I said. Mother and son team. I like that a lot. Michael overheard our conversation and smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from him in weeks. What? I asked. Just watching you to plan the future together, using all the skills and knowledge you've been hiding. It's what family should look like. Yes, I agreed. It is. The marriage counseling appointment card was simple and direct. Dr. Sarah Martinez, licensed marriage and family therapist, specializing in cross-cultural relationships and identity integration. I'd placed it on the kitchen counter where Michael would see it, along with a note explaining my terms. Michael, I'd written, our marriage can continue under one condition. We attend weekly counseling sessions to address the fundamental power imbalance that has defined our relationship for 20 years. If you're not willing to do this work, I'll be filing for divorce next month. The choice is yours. He found the note and appointment card when he came home from work, reading it twice before looking up at me. You're serious about this? Completely serious. I'm not willing to continue a marriage based on me being diminished and you being artificially elevated if we can't rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect and equality. Then we don't have a relationship worth saving. Elena, I've been trying. You've been making surface-level adjustments while the core dynamic remains unchanged. You're learning Spanish, which is nice. You've stopped correcting my English, which is basic decency. But you haven't addressed why you needed me to be smaller in the first place, or how to build a partnership between equals. Michael sat heavily at the kitchen table, the appointment card between us like a contract. What if I don't know how to be married to someone more accomplished than me? Then you learn, in therapy, with professional guidance, because the alternative is that you learn to be divorced from someone more accomplished than you. Jake walked in during our conversation, home from his after-school Spanish conversation group, another activity he'd never have pursued. When I was hiding my expertise. Everything okay? He asked, sensing the tension. Your father is deciding whether he wants to work on our marriage or end it. I said bluntly. Dad, you're not seriously considering ending your marriage to Mom over her being successful, are you? Michael looked between us. It's more complicated than that, Jake. No, it's not. It's exactly that simple. Jake sat down with us. Dad, I've watched you these past 2 months. Every time Mom accomplishes something, the conference, the business clients, the academic recognition, you get this look like someone's stealing something from you. That's not. It is exactly that. And it's embarrassing. My friends' parents celebrate each other's success. When Tommy's mom got promoted, his dad threw her a party. When Sarah's dad started his business, her mom became his biggest advocate. But when Mom speaks 8 languages fluently and starts getting professional recognition, you act like it's a personal attack. Michael's face flushed. Jake, you don't understand the complexity of adult relationships. I understand that healthy relationship involves supporting each other instead of competing with each other. And I understand that if you divorce Mom over her being accomplished, you'll lose my respect permanently. The ultimatum from our 17-year-old son was clear and devastating. Jake, I said gently, this is between your father and me. No, it's not. This affects our whole family. If Dad can't handle being married to the woman you really are, then our family was built on lies anyway. Better to end it than keep pretending. Michael stared at the appointment card, Dr. Martinez specializes in cross-cultural relationships. Yes, she understands the dynamics of marriages between partners from different cultural backgrounds, especially when there are power imbalances related to language, education, or professional status. And you think she can fix us? I think she can help us figure out if we're fixable, but only if we're both committed to honest examination of how we got here and genuine change in how we relate to each other. What would that look like? The change, I mean. It would look like you celebrating my success instead of feeling threatened by it. It would look like you asking about my work instead of dismissing it. It would look like you treating me as an intellectual equal instead of someone whose ideas need to be managed or corrected. And if I can't do that, then we'll have our answer about whether this marriage is worth saving. Michael picked up the appointment card, studying Dr. Martinez's credentials. She has a PhD in psychology, and she's bilingual in English and Spanish. Yes, I chose her specifically because she'll understand both the cultural and psychological aspects of our situation. When is the first appointment? Thursday at 7 p.m. But only if you genuinely want to do the work. Jake leaned forward. Dad, I'm going to say something, and I need you to really hear it. Mom spent 20 years making herself smaller so you could feel bigger. Now she's done with that, and she's going back to being the brilliant, successful person she always was. You can either grow up and learn to be married to that person, or you can stay small and lose the best thing that ever happened to you. Jake, I'm not finished. I spent 17 years learning from your example that women should be grateful for male attention, even when it means hiding their intelligence. I'm not going to be that kind of man. I want to marry someone as accomplished as Mom someday, and I want to celebrate her success instead of being threatened by it. You can either be a role model for that kind of marriage, or you can be an example of what not to do. Michael was quiet for a long time, processing the full weight of what our family transformation meant for him personally. I'll go to counseling, he said finally. I'll do the work. But Elena, I need you to understand that this is terrifying for me. Everything I thought I knew about our relationship, about myself, about what made me valuable to you, it's all been turned upside down. Michael, what made you valuable to me was never your superiority to me. It was your kindness, your humor, your loyalty to our family. Those qualities are still there, but they've been buried under 20 years of insecurity and control. And you think therapy can help me find them again? I think therapy can help us both learn to be authentic partners, instead of playing roles that diminish us both. Jake smiled. So we're going to fix our family. We're going to try, I said. No guarantees, but we're going to try. Michael nodded slowly. Thursday at 7 p.m. Thursday at 7 p.m. I confirmed. It was the first time in 20 years that we'd agreed to build something together based on truth instead of performance. My new business license arrived on a Tuesday morning. Official and real. Rodriguez Language and Cultural Consulting. LLC. Elena Rodriguez, licensed professional consultant. 20 years after abandoning my career for marriage, I was officially back in business. The home office transformation had been swift and purposeful. The spare bedroom that had housed Michael's dusty exercise equipment was now my professional workspace. Standing desk, ergonomic chair, high-quality camera for virtual consultations, and walls lined with my academic credentials, language certificates, and the growing collection of thank you letters from satisfied clients. My first major contract had come through Dr. Chen's network. A pharmaceutical company needed cultural adaptation of clinical trial materials for Spanish-speaking markets. 6 months, $48,000. Work I could do from home while maintaining my other commitments. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was earning more in one contract than Michael made in a year. Elena, this client wants to schedule a follow-up consultation. Michael called from the kitchen, where he'd been fielding my business calls with surprising competency. Something about expanding to Portuguese markets. Transfer it to my business line. I called back. I'll handle it after my Colombia meeting. Michael's adaptation to my professional success had been gradual, but genuine. 3 months of weekly therapy with Dr. Martinez had begun to unravel 20 years of embedded insecurity and control patterns. He was learning to see my achievements as family assets rather than personal threats. You know what's weird? He'd said during our last counseling session. I'm actually proud to tell people what you do now. Like when neighbors ask about the business calls and the conferences, I get excited explaining that my wife is this internationally recognized expert. What changed? Dr. Martinez had asked. I realized that being married to someone brilliant makes me lucky, not inadequate. It was a breakthrough that had taken months to achieve, but it felt genuine rather than performative. Jake bounded down the stairs, backpack slung over his shoulder, speaking rapid Spanish into his phone. Sí, abuela, entiendo perfectamente. Le voy a preguntar a mamá sobre las universidades en Mexico. He hung up and grinned at me. Abuela wants to know if I'd consider spending a gap year in Mexico City before college, working with abuelo and taking advanced Spanish literature classes at UNAM. What did you tell her? That it sounds incredible, but I need to research whether American universities would accept those credits. He paused. Would you help me figure out the logistics? Of course, UNAM has excellent programs, and most U.S. colleges recognize their credits. It could be a fantastic opportunity for cultural immersion and language perfection. Michael appeared in the kitchen, coffee mug in hand. A year in Mexico, that's a big step. Dad, I'm 17. In 6 months, I'll be making decisions about college, career, my whole future. Spending time in Mexico would help me understand that part of my heritage in ways I never could hear. And you'd be safe. Your grandfather would look out for you. Abuelo owns one of the largest construction companies in Mexico City. I'd be working in the family business, living with family, studying at one of the most prestigious universities in Latin America. It's not exactly roughing it. I watched Michael process the idea of his son voluntarily immersing himself in the culture. We'd spent 17 years systematically avoiding. If it's what you want, Michael said slowly, and if your mother thinks it's academically sound, then I support it. Jake looked genuinely surprised. Really, really, I've spent too many years being afraid of things I didn't understand. I don't want to make the same mistake with your opportunities. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Chen. Elena, the Columbia research position is officially yours if you want it. Part-time initially, with option to expand. When can you start? Columbia University, the institution where I'd earned my PhD, where my career had begun, where I'd first imagined a future as an academic researcher. They wanted me back. What is it? Jake asked, seeing my expression. Columbia just offered me a research position. Heritage Language Maintenance Studies. Exactly my area of expertise. Mom, that's incredible. You'd be a professor again. Research. Professor initially. Teaching might come later. Michael set down his coffee mug. How do you feel about it? Terrified and thrilled. It's everything I thought I'd lost forever. Then you should take it. Just like that, Elena. 3 months ago, I would have found reasons why it was impractical or poorly timed. But I'm learning that your professional fulfillment benefits our whole family. You're happier, more confident, more yourself when you're using your expertise. Jake clapped his hands together. So Mom becomes a Columbia professor. I spend a year in Mexico becoming actually bilingual. and Dad learns Spanish so he can keep up with both of us. That's the plan, Michael said. Though my Spanish progress is significantly slower than yours. Teens tempo, Papa, Jake said encouragingly. You have time. Hopefully your mother will be patient with a slow learner. I looked at my husband, this man who'd spent 20 years benefiting from my diminishment, and was now genuinely trying to support my growth. The process wasn't perfect. There were still moments when his old patterns surfaced, but the effort was real. I'll be very patient, I promised. We all will. That evening, I called Dr. Chen to accept the Columbia position. 6 hours later, I received an email from the UN confirming my application had advanced to final interviews. By the end of the week, I'd scheduled consultations with 3 new business clients and received an invitation to speak at an international conference in Geneva. 20 years of hiding had ended. The future was opening up like a flower that had been waiting decades to bloom. Jake found me in my home office late that night, updating my CV with yet another professional opportunity. Mom, can I ask you something? Always. Do you ever regret it? The 20 years you spent not being yourself? I considered the question carefully. I regret that it took me so long to value myself enough to stop hiding. But I don't regret that it led to you, to our family, to this moment when everything is finally possible. Even if Dad hadn't been willing to change, even then, because you would have learned that your mother is someone worth knowing, worth respecting, worth celebrating, and that would have been enough. Jake smiled. Well, for what it's worth, I think you're definitely worth celebrating. Gracias, mio, de nada, Mama. Outside my office window, the world stretched endlessly, full of languages to speak, cultures to explore, minds to change, and opportunities to seize. I was finally ready to claim all of it. The UN consultant contract arrived exactly 1 year after Jake's devastating comment. At the school conference, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, senior cultural and linguistic consultant, United Nations Development Program, 6-month renewable contract, $95,000 annually plus benefits and international travel allowances. I held the document with hands that no longer trembled with self-doubt, but steady with hard-earned confidence. 21 years after declining the UN translator position for love, I was returning to the international stage on my own terms. Mom, you did it, Jake said, reading over my shoulder. You actually did it. We did it, all of us. This happened because you had the courage to call out the lies we were living, because your father had the courage to confront his insecurities, and because I finally had the courage to stop hiding. Michael emerged from the kitchen, carrying a bottle of champagne. I thought this occasion deserved a celebration. You're not threatened by this? I asked, still sometimes surprised by his transformation. Elena, my wife just received a contract to consult for the United Nations. I'm not threatened. I'm intimidated by how impressive you are. But intimidation and pride can coexist. Dr. Martinez had taught us that distinction during our counseling sessions. Michael could feel overwhelmed by my achievements while simultaneously celebrating them. His feelings were his responsibility to manage, not mine to minimize. Jake raised his glass of sparkling cider to Mom, who speaks 8 languages, holds a PhD from Columbia, runs her own consulting business, conducts groundbreaking research, and is now working for the UN. Oh, and who makes the best tamales in Connecticut. That last one might be the most important qualification. I laughed. To Elena, Michael added, who taught me that marriage is supposed to make both partners bigger, not smaller. We clinked glasses in our kitchen, the same space where I'd hidden my diplomas, concealed my capabilities, and spent 20 years pretending to be less than I was. Now it was the headquarters of my consulting business, the place where I conducted international conference calls, and the heart of a family rebuilt on authentic foundations. There's something else, I announced. The UN position includes an option to establish satellite offices. I'm proposing to base the Latin American Heritage Language Preservation Project here in Connecticut, which means I can fulfill the contract without relocating. You'd work for the UN from our house? Jake asked. I'd work for the UN from our house while maintaining my Columbia research position, running my consulting business, and helping other families navigate the linguistic identity challenges we survived. Michael shook his head in amazement. A year ago, I thought you cleaned houses for extra money. Now you're simultaneously working for the UN, Columbia University, and private clients. A year ago, I let you think I cleaned houses because I was afraid that my actual capabilities would threaten our marriage. And now I know that hiding my light served no one. Not you, not Jake, not the families I could have been helping all these years. The phone rang my business line, which had been ringing constantly since the conference presentation and subsequent media coverage. Harvard wanted me to guest lecture. A publishing company was interested in a book about strategic heritage language concealment. Two documentary filmmakers wanted to feature my story. Rodriguez Consulting. This is Elena, I answered in crisp, professional English that no longer felt foreign in my own home. Jake grinned. I still can't get used to hearing you talk like that here. Like what? Like yourself? After hanging up. Another speaking engagement. Another consulting opportunity. I looked around our kitchen at the evidence of our family's transformation. Spanish children's books for Michael's language learning. Sat next to academic journals for my research. Jake's acceptance letter to the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico summer program was pinned to the refrigerator next to my Columbia faculty ID card. Jake, how do you feel about having a mother who works internationally? I feel like I should have had this mother all along, but I'm grateful I have her now. He paused thoughtfully. Also, I'm putting son of UN consultant on all my college applications. It looks good. It looks like I come from a family that values education, achievement, and authentic cultural identity. Exactly the kind of family I want to be from. Michael cleared his throat. Elena, there's something I've been wanting to say. Go ahead. I'm sorry, not just for the past few months, but for 20 years. I'm sorry that I made you feel like you had to choose between being loved and being yourself. I'm sorry that I taught Jake to be ashamed of his heritage. And I'm sorry that it took your refusal to hide anymore for me to realize what I'd been asking you to sacrifice. Michael, I'm not finished. I'm also grateful. Grateful that you were patient enough to give me a chance to grow. Grateful that you didn't give up on our family when you had every right to. And grateful that our son got to witness what it looks like when someone reclaims their authentic identity. And I'm grateful, I said, that when I finally stopped hiding, you were brave enough to see who I really was instead of insisting I go back to being the woman you were comfortable with. Jake stood up suddenly. Group hug. This is definitely a group hug moment. We embraced in our kitchen, 3 people who'd spent a year learning to see each other clearly for the first time. What happens next? Michael asked. Next, I start my UN consultancy focused on heritage language preservation in immigrant communities. Next, Jake spends a summer in Mexico, becoming truly bilingual and culturally grounded. Next, you continue learning Spanish so you can participate fully in the family conversations you've been missing for 17 years. And our marriage gets to start over, built on truth instead of performance, mutual respect instead of artificial hierarchy, celebration of each other's strengths instead of fear of them. Jake pulled back from our hug, grinning. And I get to grow up seeing what a healthy partnership between equals actually looks like. Yes, I said, that might be the most important outcome of all. That night, I sat in my home office reviewing the UN contract details, planning the heritage language research that would help other families avoid the 20-year detour we'd taken. My computer screen showed email after email from colleagues, clients, and institutions that valued my expertise. The woman who'd once hidden her PhD behind a cleaning lady facade was now consulting for world leaders. The mother who'd pretended not to speak English properly was now teaching other parents to celebrate their multilingual gifts. The wife who'd made herself smaller was now building a life that honored every aspect of her identity. I opened a new document and began typing my first report for the UN, Strategic Heritage Language Concealment, breaking the cycle of linguistic self-suppression in immigrant families. It was time to make sure no other mother would spend 20 years hiding her light. It was time to help other families learn what we'd finally discovered. Authentic love celebrates the whole person, not just the parts that feel safe. The woman who'd once been afraid to speak in her own voice was now ready to change the world, one authentic conversation at a time.